Chapter 2. Forming an Epistemology. Before we can interpret reality, and thus develop beneficial perspectives from it, we must first have a clear understanding of what reality is. This will require us to develop an epistemological framework for judging truth claims. We cannot make a philosophy that claims to be fact-based until we have an agreed-upon set of facts to draw from, and this can be difficult, for there are many competing ideas about the nature of truth itself. So to begin, we must first make a clear distinction between two different kinds of truth. There is objective truth, that which is measurable, quantifiable, and existent regardless of the individual, and there is subjective truth, that which is experiential, qualitative, and relative to the individual. Both of these things exist in absolute terms of reality. However, they describe entirely different aspects of it. Take something such as the reality of color. When you look at the leaves of the trees and the grass below, what do you see? You often see the color green. Yet is it true? Is green an accurate description of the object in front of you? Color is an interesting phenomenon in that it has both objective and subjective details. The objective detail of color is the physical ray of light that reflects off a leaf in the form of a photon. This photon is then captured by the eye and used by the brain to discern details about its outside environment. The subjective detail of color, on the other hand, is the vibrant visual you get in your optical field when you see. It is the thing you cannot truly describe to another person. You can only experience it with your eyes. This inability to communicate the contents of our consciousness makes subjective claims very difficult to verify. One famous question that is often asked is, how do I know the color I perceive is the same as the color you perceive? How do I know we aren't seeing entirely different colors, but simply associating them with the same objects? The truth is that you can never know for sure, as experience is entirely subjective. You cannot see through another's eyes, just as you cannot feel their pain or hear their thoughts. However, there are some discrepancies between experience that can be distinguished. Take, for instance, a scenario in which two people approach a stop sign. One of them has traditional, normal-sighted vision, and the other is colorblind due to a genetic defect. If you asked each of them what color the stop sign was, you might very well get two different answers. One might say the stop sign is red, while the other might say it is dark gray. So how do we determine which one is right in terms of universal facthood? Once we acknowledge that the visual experience of color is subjective, we can consider them both right, as it is purely circumstantial to their eyes. The perception of gray may be just as vivid to the colorblind man as red is to the normal-sighted man. However, if they were to argue about the wavelength of the light and the specific nanometers that describe its size, there could only be one right answer. It would either fit the parameters of a traditionally red wavelength, or it would not. This thought experiment is one of many that hopefully demonstrates the dichotomy between perception and physical existence, and also the barrier between fact and opinion. On matters of subjective perception, all opinions can be correct, even ones that are directly contradictory. On matters of objective reality, however, there can be only one right answer, and individual opinions, they can be discarded as completely invalid. When the details of subjective quality line up with objective reality, it is generally safe to say that the conclusion is true. The grass is green, and the sky is blue. But when these two things don't begin to line up, our conclusions grow far more complicated. There are instances, such as dreams, where people experience things that are in no way founded in physical reality. They hear the voices of characters that are purely imaginative, and see the visuals of places that never existed. Dreams are not something we consider to be literally real. Yet to say that dreams don't exist would be to draw the wrong conclusion. Dreams do exist, but only as experiences. For example, if someone told you they had a frightful dream last night, you wouldn't call them a liar. You'd acknowledge that they had the experience while knowing very well that it wasn't founded in objective reality. In this way, it is understood that some things that are perceptually real to the individual are not true objectively. And it can work in the converse way. Radio waves shoot across the world as a form of radiation, yet they are completely invisible to the human eye. They are an energy that can pass through solid objects, and this makes them nearly impossible to register in the retinas of our eyes. Because of this, we get no visual representation of their existence. From our subjective view, they don't exist. Yet we know they exist from careful testing and scientific validation. Our modern instruments have rigorously demonstrated that there are phenomena well beyond our present bodily perception. Whether it be microbes that are too small to be seen with the naked eye, or gas that is too clear to be seen in the air, science has shown us that there is more to reality than you and I understand. The fact that you can't perceive something isn't an argument against its existence, and conversely, the fact that you can perceive something doesn't mean it exists. The world is filled with qualitative and quantitative realities, and our ability to distinguish between the two makes all the difference in the world. The common misunderstanding between objective and subjective reality appears to be the source of nearly all the superstition in history. Take, for example, the early practice of shamanism. Ancient humans with little understanding of biochemistry or the central nervous system would consume psychedelic compounds such as psilocybin, ergot, and others to produce strange hallucinations in the brain. Once this level of intoxication occurred, the brain began producing a distorted representation of reality. The subjective experience of this event must have been undoubtedly profound, but the conclusions drawn from it were terribly inaccurate. Because the shamans didn't know the difference between objective and subjective reality, every hallucination they experienced can be confused with a physical detail about their world. If they heard voices coming from the forest, they might very well believe in tree spirits. If they noticed humanoid figures in the shadows, they might very well believe in demons. These perceptions would be as real as life for the individuals experiencing them. But like a vivid dream, the mind has ways of bringing things into our awareness that aren't physically real. Because of this, we shouldn't immediately dismiss the supernatural claim of angels, ghosts, aliens, Bigfoot, or anything else. We should genuinely listen to the lived experience of individuals. However, if there is no physical evidence given to the claims made, we shouldn't take their stories as objective fact either. We know very well that people do not need bad intentions in order to take part in harmful mysticism. They only need to have an authentic experience that is not grounded in physical reality. By teaching people the difference between subjective and objective reality, they will be far less susceptible to confusion. If they eat a psychedelic plant in the woods, they won't immediately draw the conclusion of a spirit world. If they experience incredible sensation during meditation, they won't immediately draw the conclusion of chakras and energy fields. If they pray to God and hear a voice respond, they won't immediately become a believer. With the knowledge of these two distinct realities, people can filter through the mistakes and misinterpretations of their own psyche and give way to a more rational and realistic worldview. Of course, this is not to say that all the things I mentioned are fake or merely hallucinations. I'm only saying that we should consider them as such until sufficient empirical evidence is given. We should take our lived experience with a grain of salt because we know very well about the infallibility of human beings. And this is also not to say that there isn't something grandiose or even supernatural about our physical reality. If radio waves can exist invisible and undetected to our traditional senses, what else might be out there? It is very possible that there are entire realms of existence beyond our wildest dreams, still waiting to be discovered. So what I'm saying is not in any way to diminish the wonder of objective reality or human experience. It is only to say that they are two distinct things, and that we must be rational in our ability to distinguish between the two. But understanding the dichotomy of truth claims is only the first step in understanding reality. Once we understand that there are two domains of existence, we still have to determine what the contents of those domains actually are. The subjective realm is far easier to understand because it's based upon experience, and experience is self-justifying. You may not know exactly what you are seeing, hearing, or feeling, but you do know for a fact that you are seeing, hearing, and feeling. In this way, the contents of consciousness are an undeniable fact of existence. What isn't a clear fact, however, is to what extent these experiences match our physical surroundings. Are the things you perceive based on real, objective structures, or are they an internal phenomenon akin to an illusion? Most of us would assume that our five senses are painting us an accurate picture of some exterior world, but we have yet to establish that there is an exterior world. There is a whole branch of philosophy called hard solipsism, which holds that the consciousness of the individual is all that there is. Much like the movie The Matrix, our world could be an illusion no more real than a dream. If this were to be true, not only would our bodies be fake, but our entire universe would be fake. Everything you've ever seen, felt, or heard in life would be an illusion within your own consciousness. And, as absurd as this might seem, it does beg the question, how can we understand the objective world when we are inherently subjective creatures? This is where the role of science becomes incredibly important. By understanding that human beings are creatures of interpretation and therefore prone to mistakes, we have an obligation to use a methodology that transcends the flaws of our individual shortcomings. The scientific method gives us just that. It begins in an imaginative or observational phase. One develops a falsifiable hypothesis about how the world works, then they gather evidence to support this hypothesis. They do experiments with the explicit intention of disproving the hypothesis, and if they are unable to disprove it, while yielding results validating their thesis, it may be an indication that they are onto something. However, the process does not end there. Once they've completed their research, they rigorously demonstrate their findings to the broader intellectual community. They pass their discoveries on to skeptical peers for review, and then see if those peers can yield similar results through repeated demonstration. Once one has overcome all of these hurdles and crafted a successfully predictive theory that fails to be shown false, they have stumbled upon an emergent scientific truth. These truths are often incomplete and sometimes circumstantial in their application, but they do give us incredible insights about the nature of reality. One of the major failures of our modern education system is that science is taught as a set of facts rather than a way of thinking. We spend too much time teaching children to memorize what we've already found to be true, rather than the methods we use to determine such facts in the first place. When science is approached in this way, it is no wonder people equate it with a dogma akin to religion. But the key difference between science and religion is that science can change its mind. There is no text in science that is sacred and unchangeable. There is no final word or prescriptive commandment cast down from a figure of authority. In science, theories are only considered apparently true when the results of an experiment bear out the experimenter's predictions. But as Karl Popper rightly pointed out in his writings on falsification, this is not always to be trusted. In the 4th century BC, the philosopher Aristotle developed his famous theory of gravity. In it, he proposed that objects fell at a speed proportional to their mass. Now, if we wanted to test Aristotle's theory, we would first have to design an experiment, one that would bear out a certain prediction if the theory held true. In this case, we might imagine that a hammer and a feather are dropped from a high place like a chair. If Aristotle's theory about gravitation is correct, the hammer will hit the ground first because it has a higher mass and therefore a higher speed. If Aristotle's theory is wrong, the feather will hit the ground first because it is an object of a lesser mass. So imagine for a moment you tried this experiment. You drop the feather and the hammer from your hands and look down to see what the results are. As it turns out, the hammer is the one to hit the ground first. This apparently confirms the hypothesis, and so you give it to others to try. They go back to their laboratories and find the same result. At this point, you might be tempted to say that your scientific finding is now an objective fact. It has passed all the steps of the scientific method, from experimentation to peer review to repeated demonstration. Yet is it truly a fact? Is Aristotle's hypothesis outright proven? Unfortunately not, and this is because of something called multi-causality. There are often many factors which can cause an event to happen. And in addition to this, objects can behave differently when put under unique conditions. The hammer may fall to the ground faster when moving under normal Earth-like conditions, but what about environments we would find otherworldly and unusual? There was another scientist that lived about 1800 years after the death of Aristotle who had a very different theory about how gravitation worked. Galileo Galilei, in his Leaning Tower of Pisa experiment, posited that objects fell at an equal acceleration rate regardless of their mass. In this experiment, two spheres of vastly different masses could be dropped from a tower and hit the ground at precisely the same moment. When this was tried, It bore out results that validated Galileo's claims. The two spheres landed simultaneously, with their mass playing no significant role. This baffled those still following Aristotle because it upended what had supposedly already been proven true. Aristotle's hypothesis could yield accurate results, it could be repeatedly demonstrated, and it could be replicated by skeptical peers in other parts of the globe. In effect, it was as much a science as anything else was. So what was it about his perspective that made it wrong? While it is true that a hammer will reach the ground before a feather under usual Earth conditions, it is not due to the hammer's mass. The reason why the two objects fall at different speeds is due to air resistance. The feather has a flatter surface area that comes into greater contact with the air, while the hammer has a shorter surface area which makes it more aerodynamic. This is why Galileo's spheres, which had vastly different masses, hit the ground at the same time. Their aerodynamism was roughly equal and did not deter them from passing through the atmosphere at equal speeds. When one witnesses this in a vacuum, it is even more clear-cut. This is why in 1969, when the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon, they performed such an experiment. With considerably low gravity and no oxygen to deter him, an astronaut named David Scott dropped a 1.32 kilogram geological hammer and a .03 Falcon feather at the same time. On video, it was recorded that the feather and hammer fell at an exactly equal rate. There on the moon, it was shown that Galileo was indeed right and Aristotle was wrong. So what does this all mean? It means that while a scientific theory can be considered apparently true, we should never treat it as absolutely true. There have been many times in history where our best evidence was faulty, our models were incomplete, and our experiments were poorly designed. This is not in any way to say that we should reject evidence, experimentation, or the scientific method. It is simply to say that we need better evidence, better experiments, and better methodology. Aristotle's theory of gravity may not have been correct, but it gave us a framework for understanding observed facts that were consistent with the evidence at the time. His theory yielded a piece of the truth, but it was not the whole truth, and this is consistent with the entire history of science. All of us are to one degree or another limited by the constraints of our times. We lack the tools, perspectives, and gathered knowledge that future generations will be able to use. For this reason, when evaluating one's character and intellectual capacity, it is not as important to focus on what one thinks, but how they think. What you think should be changing over time based on the new evidence available. However, how you think can remain consistently rational until the very end. Both a rational and irrational person will be wrong many times in their life. The only difference between the two is that a rational person will change their beliefs when new evidence contradicts them. The irrational person, on the other hand, will stay faithful to their dogma no matter what. Everyone in this world makes mistakes, but only those with sufficient intellectual humility can grow from them. So how does one think rationally? How does one develop the flexibility to grow and learn with time? Aside from the scientific method, there are two ways one can think critically and rationally. The first is to remain logically consistent in one's thought process. The other is to avoid fallacy and cognitive bias like the plague. Neither of these things can be achieved to perfection, but much like the pursuit of truth, it is a goal worth striving towards even if we make occasional mistakes. Logic, if we're going to talk about it in plain terms, is about thinking coherently. It is about assuring that your worldview is without unnecessary contradiction, and that the conclusions you come to follow from the evidence you present. To give an example of this, consider the type of logical argument known as a syllogism. A syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning in which one makes an argument by linking their premises to a conclusion. An example of this is as follows. Premise 1. All men are mortal. Premise 2. Socrates is a man. Conclusion. Socrates is mortal. If premise 1 and 2 are correct, then the conclusion must be correct. If Socrates is a man, and men are mortal, then Socrates must be mortal. However, if Socrates were in fact immortal, it would follow that he is either not a man, or we are wrong about the potential lifespan of human beings. The premises of the conclusion cannot contradict if all statements in the syllogism are true. In this way, logic guides our arguments, judging if the conclusions are sound, and science tests our premises, judging if they are true. The two work in unison, aiding our worldviews, so that we are not as prone to mistakes in our thinking. When we come to false assumptions, not because of poor evidence, but because of poor reasoning, it is usually because we've committed what is known as a logical fallacy, which causes one to falsely arrive at a particular conclusion. The number of named fallacies are too numerable to list in this chapter, but to give you an idea of what they are, let me list a few of the popular ones. Ad hominem, the character fallacy. An ad hominem fallacy occurs when one tries to refute an argument by attacking its source rather than the merits of the argument itself. For example, one might call their debate opponent stupid, untrustworthy, or immoral, rather than refuting the evidence they put forward. This doesn't mean that the attacks are incorrect. One's opponent may genuinely be stupid, untrustworthy, and immoral. The only reason why such an attack is a fallacy is because the source of an argument has no bearing on the factuality of it. We judge the factuality of a claim by its evidence. So if one wants to refute an argument, they must first refute the evidence presented by their opponents first. Ad populum, the bandwagon fallacy. An ad populum fallacy occurs when one tries to justify a position based on how many people believe it. This line of reasoning is fallacious because the popularity of a claim has no bearing on if it's true. There was once a time when the majority of people thought the earth was flat, or that the sun rotated around the earth. It didn't matter then how many people believed the claims were true. It doesn't matter now either. Once again, we judge the factuality of a claim by its evidence. So if one wants to support a claim, they should present evidence rather than appealing to authority as proof. Ad verecundium, the appeal to authority. An appeal to authority fallacy occurs when one tries to justify their position by showing its support from authority figures. The figure could be a religious leader, a scientist, a politician, an author, a poet, a philosopher, or anyone else. The reason why appealing to an authority is a fallacy is because even experts can be wrong. No human being is an expert in all fields, and even in a field where they show considerable expertise, we are all still prone to mistakes, errors, and misunderstandings. Ignorance does not evade any of us, so to treat the word of any human being as gospel is logically faulty. The list of formal fallacies goes on, but what is important to understand is that knowing them helps identify the flaws in our reasoning. Logic is one way of weeding out contradictions in our thought process. Understanding human cognition is another. Cognitive bias, which is an unhelpful byproduct of our evolutionary psychology, causes us to come to conclusions without proper reasoning. The solution to avoiding these biases is learning to identify what they are and correct for them as much as possible. Examples of cognitive bias would be confirmation bias, the tendency to accept information that you agree with without checking if the evidence is sound, in-group preference bias, the tendency to accept information coming from one group and dismiss information coming from another group, and the ostrich bias, the tendency to ignore information that is negative in origin. Cognitive biases, much like logical fallacies, are failures of our reasoning that cause us to arrive at conclusions unsoundly. Most of them are built around assumptions we either consciously or unconsciously do not wish to challenge, or they are emotional responses to confirm that which pleases us and reject that which doesn't. No one is expected to be without cognitive biases or logical inconsistencies. Being susceptible to them is part of being human. The key to being rational, however, is to search for such flaws in one's reasoning and correct your behavior accordingly. This method of distinguishing between subjective and objective claims, of being logically consistent and following the scientific method, is what I will shorthandedly call reason for the rest of this book. Reason is what I will argue we should base our philosophy on, for it is the most reliable pathway to truth. Faith, on the other hand, is the antithesis of reason. It is a belief in that which has no evidence, and is offered as an excuse to justify the irrational. Faith is dangerous because if you can get someone to believe in something without evidence, you can convince them of almost anything. There is not a single claim in this world that could not be taken on faith. And this is a problem because our beliefs about the world inform our moral judgments. To demonstrate this, I will craft a logical syllogism that includes a moral code and a truth claim about reality. Notice that depending on whether the truth claim is accurate, the moral nature of the conclusion sways dramatically. Premise 1. It is justified to use lethal force in order to stop murderers from harming the innocent. Premise 2. Gerald is a murderer who is harming the innocent. Conclusion. It is justified to use lethal force against Gerald. Premise 1 in this scenario outlines our moral code. It defines with clear boundaries that innocents should be protected and that murderers should be forcibly apprehended. Premise 2, on the other hand, outlines our understanding of reality. It states the facts we believe that inform our actions. If Premise 1 is correct, and Premise 2 is also correct, then it is entirely morally justified to use violence against Gerald. Killing him, or at least physically restraining him and imprisoning him, is a rational response to someone exhibiting his behavior. However, what happens if Premise 2 is incorrect? What if Gerald is actually an innocent man, and your beliefs about his guilt are wrong? Well, now, because you believed a falsehood, you have killed or imprisoned the wrong man. You have committed a deeply immoral action without changing anything about your moral code. This is what belief in the untrue does. It can very literally turn you into the thing you claim to be against. If your morality is to protect innocence, and your false beliefs about the world cause you to harm innocents, then your false beliefs have turned you into an immoral person without realizing it. This is where Voltaire's famous quote, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities," becomes so incredibly relevant. If you truly believe that vaccines cause autism, then it is morally justified to deny your children vaccines and leave them susceptible to disease. If you believe that Jews are not actually human, but subhuman vermin that control your society and ruin your lives, then it may be morally justified to vote for the Nazis. If you believe that the God Allah wants you to inflict pain and death upon sinners in the West, flying jets into the Twin Towers may seem appealing to you. And if you believe the words of the Pope to be synonymous with the will of Jesus Christ, you may find yourself supportive of every crusade, inquisition, and purge that the Church conducts. While it is true that there are genuine sadists and psychopaths in the world who enjoy inflicting cruelty for its own sake, most human beings believe their actions are morally justified. In order for them to take part in unjust institutions like slavery, empire, genocide, and apartheid, they must be conditioned to believe falsehoods which justify the dominant narrative. Steven Weinberg once said, "Good people can behave well, and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion." I generally agree with this statement. However, the only problem I have with it is that it's not just religion that perverts morality, but any dogmatic ideology that can be believed without evidence. Communism, fascism, and nationalism are ideologies that can be subscribed to by atheists, yet they have committed purges, forced conversions, and spread empires just as frequently as religions have. When you look at the show trials of the Soviet Union, conducted to force confessions out of political dissidents, is it really different from the Christian conquistadors forcing admissions of guilt out of pagan non-believers in the New World? When you look at the North Koreans' hysterical, over-the-top displays of devotion towards their non-elected heads of state, does it not remind you of the Egyptian pharaohs that were treated like god kings during antiquity? What these vastly different ideologies have in common is the dogmatic notion that they are in possession of an unalterable truth that must be exported by indoctrination or force. Their supreme leader, whether it be a man or a god, is presented as flawless and irrefutable. And therefore, the commands the leader gives, no matter how terrible, cannot be questioned. Certainty in one's position is what all fundamentalists have in common. The only antidote to this disease of cognition is reason. Skepticism should be applied to everything: our economic theories, our political doctrines, our cultural norms, and of course our religion. This is why I claim it is not good enough just to be an atheist. One must be consistently a skeptic in all aspects of their life, or else they open themselves up to unnecessary bias and irrationality. The great conflict in this world is not between believers and non-believers. It is of faith versus reason, and dogmatism versus skepticism. Now, there are some who will argue that we all have faith. that we all believe in something. This, however, is a conflation of faith and rationally justified belief. While it is true that we all believe something, it is not true that we all believe in something without evidence. We can be reasonable in beliefs we adopt, and for this reason, belief should be a matter of pragmatism. Since nothing can be known with certainty, everything must be judged by its level of probability. Probability will then determine whether one is going to exert the energy to go investigate if a claim is true. If someone told me they had a pet dog, I would likely believe them. This is not because I have any direct evidence that they have a dog. It is because I know people own dogs. It is a common pet. We have evidence of people owning dogs across the world. If I wanted to know they had a dog with certainty, I would still have to go see it. But since the probability of them owning a dog is high, I will not exert the time to go investigate. However, if instead of owning a dog they claim to have a pet dragon, I would need compelling evidence for this in order to believe. Dragons have not been demonstrated to exist, and in fact there is plenty of evidence that they don't. For practical reasons, I wouldn't believe in dragons. But this does not mean they don't exist. What it means is that we should follow the old Carl Sagan quote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." This too is how I treat claims of the supernatural, arguments for a hard solipsism, and other miraculous claims that would overturn our current paradigms of reality. It is not that I don't want the mysterious and profound to be true. It's that I truly care about what is true, for obvious practical and moral reasons. Getting the facts about reality right and getting the facts about morality right are the two most important things we can do. Everything about living happy and healthy lives and maintaining an advanced civilization is predicated on the notion that we sufficiently understand reality. In order to accomplish this, we cannot afford to be ideological. Anything that makes us inflexible in our thinking or unable to change our worldview to new evidence must be discarded. General theories and philosophies may be useful in helping us go about our lives and solve problems. However, as soon as they are treated as anything other than useful advice, with important exceptions, they should be viewed with scorn. Any figure of authority, whether it be religious leaders, grandiose philosophers, or scientists who have forgotten the method, that tell you they have found one ideology that explains it all, are frauds. No one person or group of people has a monopoly on the truth. We are all apes trying to grasp the cosmos. And until we discover a methodology better than skepticism and human reason, we are left with this. Adopt the ideology that says you will have no ideology. Be part of the team that says you will have no teams. Be a free thinker to the best of your ability, for it is the only thing that will reliably bring you to the truth.